Okay, so let's finish chapter 5. And so this is chapter 5, part 2, continuing with the producing of manufactured goods. And we're just finishing up the objectives. Now 5.4 through 5.7. Okay. And the assignment for this week has to do with your drinking water. So make sure that you have a look at that. It should be an eye-opener. Um, Also, it has to do with looking at EPA reporting. And I just wanted to mention to you your EPA, as just with all government bodies, if you don't have funds, it doesn't operate very well. So just looking at the different administrations and where certain funding has gone, we're looking at, again, not a really great budget for the EPA. So just keep that in mind as you are exploring your water quality. Okay. All right. Here are some updated terms that I've added. And of course, this will be in the updated PowerPoints that I will put on lines in the DocShare. So you'll find it there. All right. And here are some updated competencies, again, added to the last PowerPoints. Okay. So let's talk about physical hazards in the workplace. Do you have any? Most workplaces have some physical hazards. And I must mention too that Nancy Maxwell, she does a really great job, but she doesn't spend as much time with healthcare physical hazards, but I add those in. So believe me, we'll talk about those. So let's talk about fibers and dust because, well, okay, you're going to have a lot of patients that are going to come in probably with lung disease, perhaps because they have been exposed to fibers and dust. So let's take a look at those. First of all, it would be asbestos fibers. So these fibers are all over the world, and there's widespread occupational exposure. People who work in mining or manufacturing or construction or building ships or breaking ships apart, working on automobiles, or, these people working in these areas will carry the particles, the fibers home with them to their families. So there you go. So this is what the asbestos, they're actually kind of a glass-like silica fiber, almost like a crystal. And here's a mine up here, and this is what it would look like. So it's been around for a very long time, about 400,000 years in lots and lots of different products. Here's one over here. And okay, and just know that there are many types of asbestos. So I won't go through all the silicate mineral fibers. I basically mention them briefly, but you don't need to know them for any kind of test. So have they been so popular all these years? Whoops. Well, soundproofing, extremely insulating. I'll tell you what, if you know someone who lives in a older house, I mean a much older house. My aunt, right now, we're cleaning out her house. I'm sure it's loaded with asbestos, but the insulating properties are amazing. The place always stays very comfortable. It really does. And it's fire resistant. So how nice is that? And cheap. So let's just use this stuff, right? Well, unfortunately, okay, when you just look at a visible fiber, know that it is composed of millions of microscopic fibrils. Those are tiny little fibers, like very, very, very small, like the kind that can get into the air, and you can breathe them in and digest them, and they can get lodged in your organs, so not really great. So, yeah, easily released into the air. When they get into the air and you breathe them in, okay, a condition can occur called asbestosis. And this is the scarring of lung tissue. These are tiny little fibers, some of them. And again, they can get sometimes all the way down to the alveolar duct, so way down deep into the lungs. Again, the smaller the particles, the deeper they go, if you remember that. And of course, they can get lodged anywhere down the tree. They absolutely can. Once they get down there, your immune system's going to recognize these little fibers as the enemy, as foreign, and they will try to get rid of this, and then you're going to have inflammation. So I know it's a little difficult to see here, but if you remember from your physiology book and looking at histological samples. So these would be around the lung tissue, and you probably can't make out, but there's an awful lot of white blood cells here. But these fibers, okay, those are little asbestos fibers. So this is a white blood cell, a macrophage, valiantly, actually there's three of them, trying the best they can to engulf and destroy the asbestos fiber. But again, it's like glass. It isn't going to work. Sometimes, and scientists have described this as the macrophage being impaled upon the asbestos fiber. So, okay, this is not going to be good. You get, once the macrophage gets damaged or starts to fight attack, they send out chemical signals known as cytokines, and that brings more macrophages in, and they release more chemicals, and you get a lot of damage during this battle, right? Collateral damage. We talked about this, and you get extra fibers set down in the lung tissue, and that produces fibrosis of the lung. This can result in cancer, okay? It can. So asbestosis can definitely result in cancer. By the way, if you're a cigarette smoker and are exposed to asbestos, this is one of those synergistic effects, you know, the 1 + 1 = 7. So here we have some gentlemen here working in an asbestos mine, no personal protective equipment, not a mask, nothing here. And oh, I love this. I found this one. So cigarette smoke exposure, an ad. More scientists and educators smoke can't. Oh, golly. Yikes. Okay. Now, another condition that can occur due to asbestos exposure is a condition known as mesothelioma, and this is a little different. You probably have heard, if you get up early enough, you hear a lot of infomercials and attorneys that buy ads, and they're trying to get you to get into like a group lawsuit, and a lot of them have, we'll talk about mesothelioma, excuse me. Now, mesothelioma is a cancer of the membranes in the chest and abdominal cavity. So what happens is the fibers, as they travel, say through the respiratory tract, they can get lodged in the pleural cavity here. And through digestion, it can even get into the peritoneal cavity. So down here, okay, so they get lodged and it will cause cancer. And here we are. Here we have the bronchial tree and the poor little alveoli here looking like they've been taken over by fibrotic material. And yes, the fibers are going to escape that and get into the membranes that surround the chest cavity. So again, fibers escape the lungs or the GI tract, and most of the time mesothelioma is caused by asbestos, but there are other materials that can do this. But again, most of the time, as far as we know, it's asbestos caused, okay? Now, this is pretty lethal, pretty fast. Death occurs in a relatively short time. Okay, so let's talk about a little town in Montana. This is Libby, Montana. How beautiful, as a lot of places in Montana are. Now, in Libby, Montana, they have a mine. If you're thinking, they must mine asbestos. Well, sort of. They have a vermiculite mine. Okay. Now, for those of you who know gardening, you know that vermiculite is added very commonly to potting soil, and that helps to aerate the roots, and it is very, very common. Now, vermiculite can have a lot of different substances in them, but the one by Libby has one particular substance, and of course, that is asbestos. Okay, and the vermiculite mine near Libby is was one of the world's largest. It's closed now, and I will explain why that is. So this just shows vermiculite throughout the United States, and like I said, not all vermiculite is contaminated with asbestos. However, when they took vermiculite out of the mine in Libby, Montana, it did have asbestos fibers. Okay. So this is a case study that appeared in The Guardian US News in 2009. Dean Herod's lungs are gradually being destroyed. When he coughs, as he frequently does, his long, wheezing splutter sounds so painful it makes you wince. Herod lives in Libby, a tiny Rocky Mountain town in Montana that is isolated, beautiful, and toxic. Scores of men in this rough-edged, blue-collar town have been killed off poisoned with deadly asbestos from the local mine. But Herod is not elderly, and he was never a miner. He simply played baseball as a child on the field near the mine, and years later developed a lung disease that is destroying the life of this 44-year-old father of two young boys. There are many others like him. Asbestos was present in the air and the piles of mineral ore around the Libby mine, and the processing plant associated with it that is now closed. But it also laced the slag that W.R. Grace donated to 4 schools. W.R. Grace was the big mining operation company. And so the company donated chunks of slag to put onto running tracks, to absorb a lot of the impact of running, and gave some to the ice rink in the 1970s, and it was mixed with a lot of other materials to make 2 junior baseball pitches. Yikes. By the way, this town went on for a very long time, not wanting to even accept that there was a problem. And there was one lady, and she really wasn't highly educated. Her name is Gayla Benefield, and she was a meter reader. And so she spent her days going from door to door and checking people's meters. And she made an observation, and her observation was that as she went from house to house, she noticed there were an awful lot of young men who were home, and they were home on oxygen tanks. And some years while she was doing this, her father passed away, and he worked in the mine. And she thought, okay, well, even though he was fairly young, in his 50s, he worked in the mine, and that is just one of those things that occurs if you work in a mine. But then shortly thereafter, her mother died, and she started to be an advocate. Now, the town people actually thought she was crazy, sort of got tired of her, and really didn't want to see the problem that was before their eyes. Um, some medical scientists actually came to Libby, and they did identify the fact that, yes, they had a crazy high rate of cancer. So Libby had a mortality rate that was 80 times higher than anywhere else in the US. And okay, now the town realizes that this is what is going on. And they have removed those deposits of slag that the company had donated. And the company is bankrupt and the mine is closed. But this is just one of those things that people, have experienced. And you might have patients in your future who have been exposed to, well, these kinds of risks. Like, again, just working in a mine, thinking, well, it's vermiculite. Well, you might have gotten a little asbestos. Or a lot of people, they work in, remodeling, and they tear down walls, and there's a lot of asbestos insulation in the walls, in the attic, around the pipes, everywhere. Again, it's a really good insulator. Well, shucky darn. Can't use it though. So this just shows the deaths with asbestosis and mesothelioma, by the way, as an undergoing cause. And you can see that it's shot up quite a lot. And there's a little more to this particular graph, and as far as how long records are kept. So look in your book if you are more interested in this. Now, when it comes to regulation of asbestos, we knew a lot about this, but it took so long to start regulation. So control lagged behind understanding. We knew it was bad, but we didn't stop it. We weren't as aggressive as we should have. And truly, in less developed countries, it is still a major problem. India was trying to ban asbestos. There was a sort of a bit of an action that the people were doing, sort of a down home sort of let's stop asbestos and exposure and risks, but it didn't really take off. And there's a projected 1 million asbestos related deaths that could be occurring in India. This is taken from Pradesh, India in 2010. Just so you know, they were taking 10 million metric tons, or they have taken 10 million metric tons since 1960. And yeah, there are young kids that are being exposed to this. And what are we going to do with all this asbestos? Oh, yeah, it's a pricey thing to get it out of your house. Some of you may already know about this. And then there are even hazards associated with cotton. Nice, fluffy, natural fibers of cotton. But cotton dust can cause fibrosis as well. It's not as nasty by any means as asbestos, but it can be a problem. So if you work in a cotton mill or with cotton or maybe flax, then you are at risk. Okay. And for the same reasons, some of the fibers can get down in the lungs. You can get a fibrotic lung disease. This is called byssinosis or brown lung. Okay. And here's just an image to show you that, in fact, you do get a lot of fibrosis. It tends to be disabling. It can be fatal, but not as highly fatal as asbestosis, okay? Or certainly not as much as mesothelioma. Pretty common today in less developed countries, especially those that are putting out a lot of textiles. And when you think, oh, who's putting out a lot of textiles? You should be thinking, oh, China and Indonesia and probably India. Those beautiful fabrics from India. Well, there's a cost unless you use proper protective equipment. So again, if you're in an industrializing country, there's a problem. So there was a study between 1981, 1996. There are 24 documented cases of brown lung amongst textile workers in China and much more in India. Okay, and always remember, by the way, for every one documented case, there are probably many other undocumented. Okay. Of course, we had a lot of problems in the United States for years, and this is before we started to import most of our textiles. But this is a cotton mill in North Carolina, and not only did we have a lot of workers that were not protecting themselves and they were breathing in the fibers, but we also had problems because there weren't child labor laws during this time. This is an image that I just wanted to show you. So if you worked in a cotton mill in Great Britain, this might be your working condition. By the way, if you love sort of the historical romances, this is from the BBC, North and South. This came out in 2004. It's not bad, okay, if you like that kind of movie or TV series. So just saying. All right, so now hopefully everybody is wearing personal protective equipment when working with these fibers, either with cotton or again with flax. Okay, let's talk about mechanical hazards. So first of all, occupational fatalities. Well, overall, about 3.5 fatalities per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers in the U.S., and this is from 2010, and this was taken from your textbook. So I'm looking at, what could have caused these? Now, this is actually sort of, this is something that I took off of the internet. I don't know how much of this is real, and to be honest, I don't think any of these are from the US, but they could be. Yes, just I have a family member that would probably try this one. I'm just saying. To be honest, though, the highest fatal occupations would be your fishing and logging, and that makes sense. That's pretty hard work, and you are working with some in very dangerous conditions. Okay, about 250 non-fatal injuries for each death. Usually it's because of chronic effects of vibration. That's that's a little sound machine I have, little app. Anyway, One of the things that can happen because of that constant vibration is you can get something called white fingers, which is a peripheral neuropathy. So again, you have all that shaking. You're going to have damage to blood vessels and your nerves. This is going to result in like a numbness and or a prickling and or a burning sensation and or a freezing, maybe shooting pain, and this is going to get worse at night. By the way, inflammation and symptoms of inflammation are always worse at night. So there you go. But this would be a problem again if you are working with, oh, say a jackhammer. And there's also other problems that can occur because of vibration and also the way you hold your hands as you work. If you do repetitive manual labor, you might get something called carpal tunnel syndrome. And I like this. She says, I've got very tired arms. I have a friend who manufactures or works manufacturing washing machines and dryers. And it's so hard on her, especially when you get to a certain age. You have one particular motion over and over and over, and she's in misery. So carpal tunnel syndrome, most of you are probably pretty aware of this, maybe even personally. But this happens when you have a median nerve, okay, runs from the forearm, okay, all the way to the palm of the hand, becomes pressurized or squeezed, maybe even due to inflammation. And usually that requires a little bit of surgery. And what causes it? Again, repetitive work. Most of you going into the healthcare field probably probably aren't as much at risk, especially you're not going to be as at risk as my friend who works on washing machines. But you know, you're going to see a lot of patients who are going to be suffering from this. Noise! Okay, so when you do hear sound, this is what's going on in your middle ear. So you have words coming in, you have through your outer ear, and it hits the ear. It's coming in wavelengths. It hits your eardrum, and that sets three little bones into action, your hammer and your anvil and your stirrup. And of course, what that does is it causes a vibration into this chamber. And again, you get certain wavelengths hitting some little tiny hair cells, and they will send again vibrations and signals, sorry, to the brain, so you get hearing. Okay, so let's define noise. So noise is a sound that can damage hearing or otherwise harm health. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. When we look at effects on hearing, especially when it comes to your patients, well, a lot of your patients will come from industrial jobs, and they'll be exposed to either very loud noises or a steady, maybe a steady stream of higher than normal noise that you're exposed to, but each can cause hearing loss. So, when somebody takes a job like that, many times they will go in and get an audiogram just to get a baseline. And this will show what your normal hearing range is, your normal threshold. Now, if you have had some kind of damage, okay, some kind of hearing loss, either temporary or permanent, you get a threshold shift. Okay, usually the threshold shift is going to probably show something permanent. And the threshold shift, an upward shift in threshold at which sound at certain frequency can be perceived. So you've got hearing loss. Okay, you're shifting from your normal baseline. Like I said, this usually happens after exposure to high level of noise. I won't yell in your ear. Again, sometimes you can be exposed to noise and it's just temporary. You get just a little bit of hearing loss. If that happens, go to a quiet place. Go to a quiet place. Some people, when exposed to some kind of noise, they can get a ringing in their ears. Okay, that's called tinnitus. And, you know, maybe if you've been around fireworks or in a firing range, you might get that little ringing in your ear. Or it might be another kind of sound that you get. Usually, recovery from tinnitus is within hours or maybe in days. And this is true also with just any temporary hearing loss. Now, what happens if you have permanent hearing loss? So let's say the noise was very loud, or you had constant exposure to very, very loud noises. It wasn't just uh, one incident. Well, what happens is those little hairs in the cochlea, okay, you tend to get damage and lose some of those. These are the healthy cochlear hairs. Let me just show you this. Okay, so these would be the healthy ones, and they're just beating away, sending nerve impulses to the brain. But if you don't have any of these things left, there's no signals to send. Okay. And this is, of course, Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, and he has suffered an awful lot of hearing loss. If you've ever been to a concert, probably most of you have, you know that it's loud, and that constant exposure is definitely going to be a risk factor for hearing loss. All right, so one of the things I wanted to mention, there's a great concern right now that teenagers are losing their hearing, and more than they have at any other period in history. And the CDC estimates that 1 in 5 teens has some form of hearing loss. And that is 30% higher than it was in the 1980s or even 1990s. So more and more headphone use. So what do you do? Well, tell your teens not to use earbuds or headphones. Well, that probably won't go over very well. Maybe you yourself use these things. Maybe encourage them to turn it down a little bit. Better than that, get better headphones. Better headphones give you better quality, so you don't have to turn it up, okay? And the frequencies that it uses tends not to be quite as damaging. If there is a lot of loud noise, you use earplugs. If you go to a concert, put your fingers in your ears, whatever you need to do. Okay. What about manufacturing workers? Well, if you work in the industry, okay, there's an annual incidence noise-induced hearing loss that is estimated at 15 per 10,000 full-time manufacturing workers. So there's a lot of hearing loss, even with OSHA standards that are in place that say, okay, you need to have something to protect your workers from hearing loss, okay? So, the highest hearing loss industries would be your iron foundries. Not really common in this area, but animal slaughterhouses are. Yikes. If you're in the military, especially in the Air Force, you could imagine working with the engines, the jet engines. Military service is linked to a lot of hearing loss. There's also, this is kind of fun if you want to click on this. This is hearit.org. It's not really that's medically scientific, but it's interesting. What they will do is they will take you through a hearing test and let you know just how well you hear. I did go through it. My hearing is kind of I'm about 83%. So what I wanted to show you too is, so what is dangerous? Well, we tend to measure sounds in decibels, and this would be, for example, a decibel meter. If sounds are less than 75 decibels, even after long exposure, probably not a big deal. So if we're talking about conversations, a whisper, rainfall, okay, even a loud conversation, and maybe some moderate traffic and in a hairdryer, not a big deal. But as you get into, oh, say like a train or a factory, heavy traffic, a boombox, rock concerts, ambulance sirens, okay, for those of you working in ER, emergency medicine, okay. So that's greater than 85 decibels, whereas long or repeated exposure can cause hearing loss. So some of you might be at risk, okay? And again, if you are without earplugs, plug your ears. So smart workers, not so much. Okay. So noise pollution, what does it affect? Well, again, hearing loss. Yeah, but it can also cause pain, increased blood pressure, insomnia, depression, stress, anxiety, irritability, poor concentration, altered brain chemistry, and behavioral changes. This is from the American Tinnitus Association. Let's flip this just for a second and talk about healing sounds. There's a lot of good information out there that suggests that there are certain sounds that are very healing. I think people know this. Pet therapy and music therapy programs are all over and used to complement cancer treatment. So this is an interesting little study that I found. You are certainly welcome to look that up. But I also wanted to mention something else. This is the sound of my cat, Billy. She's named after Billie Holiday because she has a very good set of pipes and she sings the blues a lot. But one of the things you should know is a little bit about cat purring. So whether or not you're a cat fan, you should know that cat purrs within kind of a consistent pattern between 25 and 150 hertz. And lots of research suggests that sound frequencies in this range improve bone density and promote healing. Cats have been known to self-heal purr. Sometimes when there's another cat who's not feeling very good, they will purr next to that cat. Sometimes they've been known to do it for their owners. And I liked this picture because this man definitely looks very, very stressed. So there's something to cat purring. Okay, so if you have a cat, pet your cat. All right. So let's change gears a little bit. What do all of these have in common? Let's see if you know. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Thinking radiation? Hold on. The Challenger explosion. The Exxon Valdez disaster. What do they have in common? Well, it turns out all of them were linked to individuals, either one person or several, who didn't get enough sleep, who suffered from just sleep deprivation. And I don't know if you remember hearing about the Challenger, but this happened in the 1980s, and I remember that. There was a school teacher, and this is before I was going into education, but she went up in the space shuttle and it exploded. Turns out that one of the managers, actually a few of the managers from NASA, were functioning on just a couple hours of sleep. And all of these are due to man-made errors. And people who were in charge, they didn't have the correct response time. And it was clear that they were sleep deprived. Well, what about healthcare providers and sleep deprivation? What do you think happens? There was a lot of publicity about how physicians in training were treated and the hours that they had to keep and how dangerous this is. And you are probably familiar with this, probably firsthand, but they did this all stemmed from a Joint Commission report, and they did a certain research project that demonstrated that physicians in training working traditional schedules with recurrent 24-hour shifts experienced the following. They made approximately 36% more serious medical errors than those whose scheduled work is limited to just 16 consecutive hours. They made 5 times as many serious diagnostic errors, have twice as many on-the-job attentional failures at work, and a lot of them are working the ER, you know. They suffer 61% more needle sticks and other sharp injuries after their 20th consecutive hour of work. They double the risk of a motor vehicle crash when driving home after a 24-hour day at work. All right. What about nurses? Well, okay. Most nurses work extended work hours, don't they? This study looked at just over 2,200 nurses between November of 2002 and April of 2004. And they surveyed nurses that had to work 13 or more hours per day, at least once per week. And this is what was reported. 16.3% of the respondents reported having suffered a needle stick injury. What about the impact on the patient? Well, nurses working greater than 12.5 consecutive hours are at significantly increased risk of making a medical error. And now you're maybe thinking about yourself, gosh, yeah, but I need to, sometimes you need to step up and you need to work valiantly. And this is the work ethic in the United States. But imagine if it was a loved one in the ER or a loved one who was in critical care. All right. So, yes, we're going to talk about sleep. And in the book, it's called Light During the Biological Night. And I'm going to talk about, I included this meme because it made me laugh out loud. So maybe you know this personally, where she's calling her friend. I know you work the midnight shift and sleep during the day, but I just really wanted to call and chat. And then it's followed by God bless all night shift nurses, 24-hour EMSs, and first responder firefighters. This one's for you. Okay, the grammar's not so good, but still, it made me laugh. Okay. Know that all living creatures on this planet have evolved to have clocks set according to, well, some kind of cycle. So every living thing has a clock. I know, this made me laugh too. All right, so what happens when you are exposed to light during a biological night? Well, this is what the textbook talked about. Talked about shift work can disrupt something called circadian rhythms. What's a circadian rhythm? Well, these are the basic physiological day-night cycle or clock. Okay, and shift work. Okay, that messes up our circadian rhythms occurs all over the place in manufacturing, even finance, real estate, food services. I'd like to shout out to educators, as I'm usually up late at night, but also healthcare workers. Hello, author Nancy Maxwell. So she needed to put that in there. She didn't. I did. All right. Yes, we all have an internal clock. Now, this wasn't well studied until this man, who is a French scientist, Michel Siffre, in 1962. And he went into a cave in Texas. So, a subterranean cave that had absolutely no natural light whatsoever. And there was nothing to give him any indication of what time it was or what day it was. He had no clock, no calendar or sun, and he kept track of normal body rhythms, and he kept track of where he thought he was, where the days started, where they ended, where the sleep cycle should start, where it should end. And again, he slept all and ate only when his body told him, just naturally, just to see what would happen and to see, okay, is there an internal clock? And he found that, in fact, yes, there were natural rhythms of human life and that they were there. They were internal in the cells. And it was a very interesting uh, sort of finding. He did tend to lose hours, though, but all the same, he did have a natural rhythm. And they say that this particular clock is beyond time kind of clock. Okay. When he went out, when he left the cave, he was wondering why he would lose. He kept losing a couple hours. And other scientists, including Michel, went back to do some more studies. And this is what he found. Different people did have different clocks. Okay. Some people had a slower clock, a 25-hour clock instead of 24. These were the owls. Some people had fast clocks, 22 hours. Okay. These were the larks. So owls and larks. So what are you? Are you a night owl or are you morning lark? I tend to be more larkish, just to let you know. So how does our body know when it is time to sleep? Again, there is an internal clock, but we do know that light does play a role in setting our clock. okay? Or basically our circadian rhythm. So, all right. Now, how do we perceive light? Well, if you remember from anatomy, light is, it's going to enter the cell and it hits the retina, right? And that's where you have photoreceptive cells. And of course, then those signals leave through the optic nerve. Okay, two parts of the brain. But it turns out there is a very special photoreceptor area with very special receptive cells that particularly sense light for our biological clocks. Okay. So again, here we have light coming through, and hitting the retina cells and the special photoreceptor cells, and then out through the optic nerve. And where does the signal go? Well, there are a few stops along the way, but again, eventually, what it will hit is a part of the brain. Now, particularly a part of the brain called the pineal gland. Okay. And so these little photoreceptors are going to either sense light or a lack of light. And that signal, again, is going to be sent to the pineal gland. Oh, there's light outside. Oh, there's no light outside. All right. So what does the pineal gland do? Well, if there's not a lot of light coming in, it's kind of getting late, it's getting dark. Well, what it does is it increases a particular hormone known as melatonin. So the cells in the pineal gland manufacture and release melatonin. Now, if the light goes up, like, it's morning. Okay, so then you get the light signal, and the pineal gland says, oh, no, no, we need to suppress melatonin. Okay. So melatonin, we know this particular hormone plays a really important role in day and night cycles. Okay. If it's nighttime, the pineal gland has to make more. If it's daylight and you have to be awake, then, okay, you need to inhibit. So no more melatonin should be made. And this cycles, by the way, it does. And this is what gives us our particular body clock. Just a little side note, by the way. When it comes to light coming through and the light spectrum, do you remember seeing the electromagnetic spectrum? Oops, sorry. Let me move down here. Okay. The electromagnetic spectrum, and you have visible light, right? You have those big wavelengths, not a lot of energy in the red area, and then the wavelengths get smaller, 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 and then you have a lot of energy over here with the purples, okay, and the blues and the purples. Turns out the light waves that really inhibit melatonin and your signals to go to sleep are on this side. So let me just put it to you this way. If in your bedroom you have clocks and electronic gear of any kind that emits kind of a blue to a purple light, you need to get something else because, again, you're really going to perceive wavelengths between 460 and 480 of this particular electromagnetic spectrum. So get rid of those. It's a little hard to find alarm clocks with red, and most people don't use alarm clocks anyway. You use your cell phones, but I'm just telling you, if you have any lights in your bedroom, okay, make sure they're red, or maybe put a little red filter on them. And so melatonin, this is, again, it's going to regulate certain aspects of your whole body and your function. And it's going to, it's going to tell the body basically it's time to go to sleep. So yeah, you don't want anything inhibiting your production of melatonin. All right, so let's go through a normal 24-hour clock, one that is more on the natural cycle, that isn't interrupted, okay? So, first of all, normally the first 3 hours following sleep, which should be somewhere between 7 and 11, that's what scientists say, those are the early mornings. This is when your melatonin decreases, and another hormone called cortisol begins to increase. Now, there are other hormones that are involved in the sleep-wake cycle, but I'm pretty much going to stress melatonin and cortisol. During this time, by the way, you should also know that blood vessels are a little stiffer. They don't widen as easily first thing in the morning. Blood cells tend to be a little stickier also first thing in the morning. Now, here I have a nice lady and she's getting up and she's, okay, let's say she's making breakfast, although she's peeling carrots. But there's usually an increase in blood pressure in these early morning hours. The reason I bring this up is that you should know that, especially in older patients and people at certain risks, might have certain fatty deposits that break off, lodge in blood vessels, and can cause blockage more at this time than probably any other. So this is a time for a potential heart attack. So the reason I bring this up is morning exercise the best time. So if you want to go out and do some vigorous exercising at this time, probably not. Maybe consider in the evening exercise. Why? Because, okay, your blood pressure tends to be about 10 to 11% less, and your blood vessels are a little more flexible, and it just is a healthier time to work out. Now, when it comes to working out, it doesn't have to be intense, especially with this lady. Starting out walking, a little bit, a few times a week, increase 5 minutes every day or every week. Of course, that will make things better for her. All right. What about the next part of the clock? 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. What do we have to say about this? Well, by this time, the melatonin levels are down and cortisol is up. So cortisol is your awake. Sometimes they call it the stress hormone. These are coming from the adrenal glands, if you remember, around the kidneys. So this is you're at your peak performance at this time, at least for, taking exams, maybe attending a class. You'll probably do your best at this time. Okay. 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, you get a bit of a crash of energy, about a 25%. So why? Because your cortisol normally goes down. This is just natural. And this is actually a natural time for a nap, like a little micro sleep. So maybe if you can, and I don't know about you, but I can't, but if you have that ability, take a nap. 4 p.m. is actually the best time to work out. You have an increase in body temperature, less muscle pain, and okay, balance is actually better in the morning, it turns out, but still, working out, this is a good time. Okay, prime time, 6 to 8 p.m. This is when a lot of people have their meal, and in the United States, uh, people have their biggest meal at this time, right before they go to bed. Not a good idea. And I'm totally guilty of this. I'm just telling you the facts. But it's not a good idea. You should always have your biggest meal should be breakfast, followed by a moderate lunch, and then a very smaller dinner around dinner time. It turns out studies have shown that you can have the same calories at breakfast and at dinner, and they are treated differently. So at breakfast, it turns out that, your blood glucose levels are removed much better. Metabolism is gearing up, so you handle things much, much better. Sadly, at dinner time, blood glucose levels remain high. They're not cleared, and this could contribute to diabetes and some other problems. Okay. And if you're a midnight snacker, also not good. All right. 8 to 10 o'clock p.m. This is when the clock is winding down. Well, that's for us larks. Maybe you are a night owl, and this is when you're starting to rear up. Okay, well, some people do run on that clock. So this is when they go out. So in the morning time, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Again, the body should be pretty much wound down for everybody. We know that the body temperature decreases, the blood viscosity goes up, blood pressure decreases, metabolism drops. Interestingly enough, most people die between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. My aunt who just passed away, actually, that's about the time she passed. Um, Also, interestingly enough, most births appear at this time. Well, turns out we're most relaxed at this time. So, okay, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock a.m. Most births appear at that time. Interesting little fact. Now, when it comes to setting your clock, fooling your clock, really light has the biggest impact. Natural light especially. Okay. Light in the morning, this is going to speed up your clock and this can help you. So if you have to get up really early in the morning, as I do, get yourself a light. Try to put a natural light bulb in there. Again, the spectrum with the shorter wavelengths, those are going to be the better ones to take down the melatonin and kind of ramp up the cortisol. Light in the evening, okay, so if you need to stay up late, which I do that too, then that slows down the clock where, okay, you're getting to that time where you're, okay, it should be winding down, but oh, I'm still seeing a lot of light. So again, turn on the light bulb, and that should slow down the clock if you have to delay sleepiness for your job, for studying, what have you. It's not great, but some of us have to do this. I wanted to talk a little bit about teenagers. Okay, teenagers. Some of you probably just left that particular time in your life. Some of you might have teenagers. Some of you might know a teenager. Adults sometimes and mistakenly so, think that teenagers are lazy. This is not to say that some teenagers aren't lazy. Yes, of course, all human beings can be lazy. But there is a very interesting study from Oxford University in the UK just this year, and it looked at circadian rhythms in teens. Okay, so here's what you need to know. Once a human being reaches the age of 10 until about the age of 21, they have a very delayed circadian rhythm. What does that mean? Well, that means that, okay, as they are in their adolescence and their early adulthood years, they want to stay up late and, okay, and go to bed later and later and then get up later. This is not good, particularly if you are a parent of a teenager and you need to get that student up for school. Or if you are in this particular cycle of your life, then you might know it's a little hard for you to get up in the morning. You want to stay up. And by the way, that's perfectly reasonable. That is normal. It's a biological process. And this happens to teenagers regardless of their environment. But what do you do? So some of you have nursing jobs. Some of you have jobs, you have classes, you have to get up. Or if you have a teenager and they need to get to school because you need to get to work, you're gonna, unfortunately, the way we live forces us to change their clock. Okay, try to change it. It doesn't work very well. It does lead, unfortunately, to sleep deprivation in teens. So in the weekends, sometimes they have a sleep debt and they have to go pay that debt in the weekend and get extra sleep if they can. But unfortunately, most teens think that is the time to really go out and have fun. So it's very difficult. So yes, we get this shift when we're younger. Okay, when babies are born, of course, they're not on much of a clock at all, but eventually they do get into a circadian rhythm that says, okay, I can get up early and be more of a lark. Okay, but then once you hit, again, the age of 10, you start to become a night owl until about 21. Some people kind of stick there. Some people are always in, the night owl range. It just happens. Okay. By the way, young students, like I said, they do better with PM tests than AM tests. And for a teacher, and myself, I'm a lark, so, I'm always ready to teach that class first thing in the morning. But I've always found, and I see this just with my small little sampling, that my classes that meet kind of later on do tend to do better with the same exam. It just happens. There's nothing we can do about it, you guys. Okay, your teachers, you can show them the evidence. You can say, I couldn't get up this morning because I am still in this particular circadian rhythm. They're going to say, you got to get up. So go buy yourself some light. Okay, sorry. Now let's talk about older sleepers. All right, you're going to get maybe patients Probably you'll get patients like this. Maybe your own parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles are at this stage. Turns out when we hit 55 years of age, you kind of go back to the 10-year-old sleep pattern. Um, and it turns out about a third of people over the age of 65 are bad sleepers. They just don't sleep. They just aren't out of sync. Now, here's what scientists think. They hypothesize that it could be that they're just not getting enough light. Maybe they're spending too much time indoors. So maybe they need to get out in the sunshine. And also cataracts, they start to form and they start to block a lot of sunlight signals. And maybe a lot of the spectrum that signals, okay, that it's light time, and so you get some of that cortisol during the day when you're supposed to. And again, the cells, those photoreceptor cells are all there, still back in the retina, but they're just not active. So here's a thought, and there's a lot of science to support this. Give nursing home residents more light exposure. Okay. There was a study, and I think this is so cool. And maybe you don't know somebody with Alzheimer's yet, but statistics say you will. Okay. There was a study that where researchers gave Alzheimer's patients in a nursing home, okay, 3 times more light during the day. And, this is without, so they, as an alternative maybe to a lot of medication to help them sleep and to improve mood. But just by improving light, the study was even more revealing than they thought. They had even better results than they thought. They were kind of going for sleep. But what they got was also improved mood, decreased depression, increased activities during the day, increased cognitive ability, and all without the sleeping pills and side effects of sleeping pills. So just something to think about. So if you work in a nursing home, and a lot of you probably do or will, or know somebody in a nursing home, get them out in the sunshine. Maybe get them a light for the room. And again, not just any light. You have to get something with the natural spectrum and give them as much light as they possibly can. Okay? This is a horrible disease. They need all the help they can get. And if you want to read more about this, here it is. Be my guest. It's an interesting study. Okay, so let's talk about another aspect of light and healing. So it turns out that different organs have sort of their own clocks as well. So there's a circadian rhythm, yes, and certain things go on, certain things go off. We know that genes get turned on, genes get turned off, and certain cells have certain activities during certain times of the day. So here's what they have found with some very wonderful evidence that said that, okay, if you time when you give patients chemotherapy, you can improve their treatment. So why is that? Well, we know that when a patient gets chemotherapy, it's just there to kill cells. It turns out that rapidly dividing cells, okay, get hurt a little bit more than the good healthy cells, but the good healthy cells do get hurt. So when chemo kills good cells, you get overall bad performance by that drug. Okay, it's just not good. And also your immune system has cells that are good, and you don't want chemo affecting them because guess what? They get into the battle and fight cancer cells as well as fighting infectious diseases. So, turns out with this study, chemo works better during certain times in a cycle. So looking at metabolism, DNA repair, there's something called apoptosis, which is when cells are supposed to detect that something's wrong with them, like, oh, there's cancer, and undergo cell suicide, which is the technical term for cell suicide, is apoptosis. So if you give people chemo drugs at the right time, good cells will be repaired, bad cells will undergo apoptosis, and it will also decrease the amount of blood vessels that are made to feed cancer cells and tumors. So it will decrease something called angiogenesis. All of this because timing when chemotherapy is administered. Now, how do they track this? So, okay, if I have your interest, and I hope I do, How do they know? Well, they actually can follow this by following skin temperature. And on average, it turns out that chemotherapy given at 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. gives you the best results all the way around. Five times less damage to healthy cells and twice as much killing of cancer cells. How great is that? All right. Moving on, night shifts. All right. So what do we do when we fight our clocks and we're exposed to light all night? Well, if we are exposed to light at the wrong time, this does confuse our system. Okay. We don't have a choice. This is the best thing we can do, but it still confuses our system. So even though I said go out and get some light, okay, with the natural spectrum, well, okay, it does work to a certain extent. Light does suppress the production of melatonin and it does promote wakefulness, but it delays our sleep and it messes with the whole circadian rhythm and, okay, and all the sleep dependent processes. So you get a little bit of jet lag. If you've ever experienced jet lag, you get a sleep deprivation jet lag. By the way, so do we get used to it? Well, some people do. It depends on the people, like everything. But it turns out that you can work night shifts for years and your circadian rhythms never get into sync, okay? You never have a good sleep-wake cycle. And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that while you're trying to get some sleep during the day, you are still exposed to natural light. And natural light is always brighter and more effective than artificial light. So, again, if I were you and you have to do this, get visible natural light in light bulbs while you're staying awake. And when you go to bed, make sure there's no light getting into your room as best you can. You have to buy special curtains, blackout curtains. People in Alaska and Iceland do this all the time. You get blackout curtains, you get like a face mask, an eye mask, and just turn off all of your light sources. It's the best way you can do this. Okay. And if you don't, you can get a whole bunch of problems. Okay. And even so, you're still going to probably be a little off. So working through the night means that you're going to be working when you should be sleeping, and your body's metabolism is going to let you know that this isn't right. This also will increase bad eating decisions. So you're going to have different cravings during these weird cycles. So, oh, look, it's a picture of me. Oh, no, that's not me. Again, so if we're fighting our clock, our body increases the production of hunger hormones. This causes us to crave sugary, high energy foods, high fat foods, fast foods. You're going to get a lot of weight gain and obesity. And okay, what does that lead to? Insulin resistance increases your susceptibility to diabetes. And okay, this also activates our stress systems. So you got cortisol running all the darn time. Okay, so not good. So that puts pressure on the cardiovascular system, gives you a greater risk of heart attack. And okay, you can try using, like me, you use stimulants, and that's to counteract tiredness and sleep deprivation. But it could also, when you're trying to sleep, it could affect the quality of the sleep that you do try to get. Okay. And so all negative consequences are made worse by the fact that when you do get sleep, like I said, after a night shift, you just don't get good sleep. And and I'll talk about how the sleep cycle occurs. And sometimes that's interrupted and you never get quality sleep, even if you do get your 8 hours in. Okay. By the way, light during a biological night, so if you're up all night, that is classified as a group 2A carcinogen. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, counteracting the clock puts you under enormous strain, increases cancer risk, increases cardiovascular disease risk, increases the risk of mental health disorders, and obesity. Here's just to summarize, and this just shows how the melatonin levels cycle through the body. So again, if you're getting frustrated because sometimes science gives you information that you don't want to hear, um, So again, what do you do? What do I do? Because I'm up very early. Sometimes I'm up at 3 a.m. and sometimes I'm working till 12 midnight. So I have natural light bulbs and I try to use light as much as possible. And when I go to sleep, I buy melatonin. By the way, look up the health benefits of taking melatonin. Take it right before you go to sleep. It really makes a difference as best you can. Um, yeah. Okay. And just as a side note here, I'm not going to go and talk about all the different stages of sleep. Of course, it's really important to get a full night's sleep. We recommend, well, I should say medical scientists recommend approximately 7 hours of sleep. But on average, Americans get somewhere around 6 hours. And the consequence of not getting enough sleep is that you don't get a good non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep cycling through the night. And during this time, you get a lot of hormones released. Your immune system gears up and takes care of things well, yeah, they do a good patrolling, checking for anything that doesn't belong there. We know that people that don't get enough sleep, they get very, very ill. Lab animals can only live a certain amount of time without sleep. I mean, they die. We know that brain cells tend to die without sleep. Sorry, so not good. Speaking of, okay, so let's move into asthma causing agents in the workplace. And I know we talked about asthma, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. You don't need to know this for the test, but as you remember earlier, asthma can be triggered by certain environmental factors, things that are detected by the immune system as foreign. And so it's like an allergy, but in the respiratory tract, it tends to be a little more severe than just an allergy. So when exposed to certain substances, chemicals, you get all kinds of chemicals called inflammatory mediators. They can cause spasms of the bronchial tubes, a lot of mucus production. At this time, the antihistamines aren't going to work because it's not just about histamine being released from those granulocytes. You're going to have something else like corticosteroids. All right. And we know that asthma is part genetic, but it's also partially environmental. So people who have asthma need to watch their exposures to certain things. Now, something that asthmatics can be exposed to in the workplace is something called isocyanates. And isocyanates are very common as paint hardening chemicals. My father, I think I might have mentioned, he was a machinist, but he also loved to work on cars. And he had a Model A and a Model T, and he loved to paint cars. He did a lot of it. So he was exposed to a lot of these things. Amazingly enough, he never got asthma, as far as I know. Also, certain metals can trigger asthmatic attacks. Aluminum, which is found in soldering, chromium and nickel, which is found in if you work in electroplating. Maybe you're in a factory that produces jewelry. Maybe not so much in the United States, but in India and China, yeah, lots of those. And if you work in just about in any industry, there's going to be some kind of dust particle, something in the air, a fume, something organic that can also trigger asthma. Okay, so lots of things, always occupational hazards. All right, so let's look at patterns in exposure to products and byproducts of manufacturing. Especially, let's talk about industrial pollution and workplace exposures in the United States. Okay, so let's look at industrial pollution and workplace exposure. And there is a lot of social disparities. Usually, certain ethnic groups, and of course, certain people in certain socioeconomic um, groups, sometimes they get the jobs that expose them to more environmental risks. Okay, those are the jobs that are available. Do they have a master's or a PhD? Well, few people do. And a lot of these places pay fairly well and they need a job. So what do you do? So this makes sense. And where are they going to live? Well, if they live next to this industrial complex, well, that's convenient. Now, is real estate going to be very expensive around big industrial complexes? Well, no. You're probably not going to see a $1 million home right next to a crude oil refinery. Okay, it's not going to happen. But real estate is inexpensive, so people who make a modest income, that's probably where they're going to have to live. And again, this might be close to where they work. Okay, because of that, they're going to be exposed more and more to industrial pollution, and they're going to be exposed to occupational hazards. So people in these groups, okay, they're going to require a lot of, health care at one point or another. There's a lot of particulate air pollution, not just in the workplace, but again, wherever they live, and some of these things are carried home with them when they go home. Also, you have to wonder, okay, so you can think about what's the groundwater around here? What's the air like around here? So, yeah. And there's a quote from Julia Brody from the Silent Spring Institute, and she says toxic pollution from oil refineries, and this could be from any factory, doesn't stay outside. It seeps into homes where people spend most of their time. So, you're not going to be protected unless, of course, there are certain regulatory bodies looking out for you. Okay, so expanding on the theme of industrial pollution and workplace exposure and disparities as far as, again, if you're very wealthy, you're probably not going to be exposed to these pollutants and these problems, both at work as well as at home. But if you are in the lower socioeconomic areas and populations, well, then you are going to have exposure, and not just around mining communities. And of course, mining communities, they are not very wealthy. But I also wanted to point out, and this was also pointed out in the book, excuse me, where you have Navajo Native Americans who have for so long been exposed to uranium mining. And of course, uranium is very radioactive. And no matter where you look along the Navajo reservation, you can probably see at least what was left over of uranium mining. And I have this particular sign that I got, of course, from Google. Water from this well is not safe to drink. And again, this water has been tested and found to exceed Navajo EPA and US EPA human drinking water standards for uranium and other contaminants. So the Navajo Nation policy is that livestock use only wells that are not to be used for human drinking water. Eee. But again, this has been quite a problem when it comes to environmental justice. Does the Navajo Nation have very rich lobbyists in Washington? No, not really. Many times the not in my neighborhood only sticks if your neighborhood is very, very wealthy and you can support certain political groups. Okay, let's be honest. All right. Let's also talk about people in micro environments and chemical burdens. This is rather interesting. And to be honest, when I read this, I didn't realize. Okay. But now, when it comes to bisphenol A's and PFCs, it turns out that different income groups and ethnic groups have different blood serum levels. Now, that doesn't seem surprising, but I guess I didn't realize that even the people in the higher income range get more BPA. So that was rather interesting. Now, keep in mind from my previous lecture, BPA, PFCs, these are, PFCs is stuff you spray in the air, BPA, that's like the plasticizers, right? All of these are, they're endocrine disruptors, right? Now, we know that they're all over everywhere. They are ubiquitous in people's urine and blood, and U.S. studies detect them in greater than 90% of the people tested. And it turns out that people with a higher income have higher blood levels of BPAs. So why is this exactly? Well, there's some hypotheses due to certain evidence. It turns out, again, food containers, possibly, maybe part of that new car smell. Yeah. Maybe you heard about that. That new car smell, not good. Low income individuals, well, it turns out that they have more PFCs. So, more PFCs in their blood and urine. And this could be because maybe the furniture is starting to, well, it's starting to fall apart. And some of the flame retardants are being released with kind of dust and all of that. So, you get more indoor air and dust particles. So, people of lower income have higher PFCs, interestingly enough. Well, not, I mean, it makes sense, but they're still working out as to all of the routes of exposure. Now, here's a case study that does demonstrate the burden of chemical exposure and the lack of environmental justice, sometimes in lower socioeconomic communities. Now, these ladies are from Warren County, North Carolina. This image was taken in the 1970s. So it turned out in their community, there was illegal midnight dumping of 60,000 tons of PCB contaminated soil between June and August of 1978, contaminating about 150 acres. And okay, is this going to leach into the groundwater? What's this all going to do? So, but again, this was at nighttime, midnight dumping. So it's not as if, oh, we didn't really know this was really bad. This all came from a toxic waste spill, a little whoopsie-daisy. So this soil that was contaminated with PCBs, they were wondering, oh, what to do with this? Oh, yes, there's 150 acres. Who's going to stop us? Well, okay. Well, this did lead to years of lawsuits. And guess what? Okay, so this had to be cleaned up. The people who dumped it had to clean it up. So this was, Warren County was one of the first cases in environmental justice in the United States. Unfortunately, not everybody is that lucky. Okay, so what about global disparity in protections for workers? Well, here's something, I don't know if you know this, but we developed countries, we like to send our garbage to other countries. And okay, it's cheaper to export them than to deal with them ourselves, especially when it comes to electronic components. And some of these things have their own toxicity problems, right? Workers in less developed countries, they're the ones that are exposed and they bear the burden of illness and injury. So this gentleman here is sorting through old cell phones and electronic devices for recycling and reusing, which is nice, but he didn't make this mess. So yes, we do a lot of recycling of used computers. Most of that is sent to China and India, and it's still, and they do this again for saleable components. There's also something called ship breaking. If you read the book, you know about that. Their image is different than mine. This is the image they have. This is the image I have. So here's a nice little ship. This was called the Oriental Nicety. How sweet. And so, it had a little problem or two. And so, well, it was going to be taken in and broken apart for scrap metal in India, this little place in India. So you can see they're starting to break this down. And why do I talk about Oriental Nicety? Oh, you've heard of this ship before. It had a different name. This is the Exxon Valdez. Okay. They tried to send it out with a different name and rechristened it, but Alaska banned it from being anywhere around their shores. And finally, it pretty much had to be beached and broken apart. Anyway, and there's a lot of exposure to chemicals when they do this. In fact, a lot of ships have asbestos. Okay. How about regulation of industrial pollution? Well, this is kind of funny. It says news item, estrogen imitating chemicals in the environment suspected of wide-ranging biological anomalies, including hermaphrodism in animals and lower sperm counts in human beings. Well, we in the business community prefer a cautious wait-and-see approach over needless media scare mongering, which I gotta like. That was funny. Okay. So what about regulation, specifically of endocrine disruptors from chapter 5 part 1? Okay, keep in mind scientists only advise. They do not make policy. Who are the scientists? Well, generally the scientists that are around that do this are part of EPA and FDA. Um, but it's difficult because these are government agencies. How strong they are depends on funding. If the government, okay, the standing administration says, we will give you lots of money, you can hire scientists, you can go out and you can check for pollution, you can see, okay, where are the thresholds? What is considered a hazardous risk? What are not? Maybe we can develop new testing methods. Okay, that's great. But if you don't have a lot of funding, okay, well, then you're in trouble. And it does depend on government spending. And where is the burden of proof that a chemical is hazardous if there's no agencies out there checking? Normally, it's sort of the people. Okay, there's not a lot of people out there testing for pollutants out there. Okay, if these agencies aren't, there are some groups, and they are out there. They're not well funded, and sometimes they work completely on contributions, but most people don't even know there's a problem, let alone be willing to give and donate money. Also, you should know that the endocrine disruptor screening program hasn't really been changed since the 1930s. Now, how many new chemicals do you think have been produced since the 1930s? Yeah, not good. Most of these tests don't even look for the minute amounts of toxicants. And if you remember, it only takes a little bit of these chemicals to disrupt the endocrine system. Your whole endocrine system works on minute concentrations, tiny, tiny little concentrations, and it can throw everything off. Well, one thing we could do, if only we could get rich lobbyists out there, but that's not who has the money. The environment doesn't really have a lot of rich lobbyists out there. We did get protective legislation with lead, um, and that was doable, but especially when it comes to all the petroleum products that are plasticizers and all of that, you're going to have to fight the petroleum industry, and they're not going to easily want to invest all that money and get rid of their old plastics and make new ones. So this is going to be, and then you have DuPont they're kind of used to doing things a certain way. So you're going to have a lot of very, very, very rich people out there that aren't going to want to change the way they do things. So maybe the best thing to do until we can get legislation going, keep pregnant women and children away from fields sprayed with pesticides, limit their exposure to plastics, never microwave with plastics. Be careful with water and dust and food that might be contaminated with these kinds of toxicants. So what about the plastics, though? Don't they have labels? If you flip them over, they usually do. And don't they have to? Nope. Turns out food packaging, they really don't have to have any information that tells you exactly what they're made of. Most information is voluntary, but if you remember from the previous lecture, a lot of industrial chemists don't want to share those secrets because, well, then other people could go out and make their plastic. So it's kind of a industrial secret many times. Mostly when you look at the bottom, it only gives you a recycling ranking, and that doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you every chemical in there. And also, sometimes they'll have something that says free of, a nice little free of a chemical, right? Like BPA free. Oh, good. So no bisphenol A's. Yay, it's all safe. Well, as a very clever student of mine once said and asked, well then, but if they didn't put that in there, what did they replace it with? What is in there? And how clever she was. She was absolutely right. So, all right. There was a U.S. Centers of Disease Control and Prevention's National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey. Kind of gives you an idea of the problem here. So, and here's a quote. It says, food packaging chemicals are not disclosed, and in many cases, we don't have toxicology or exposure data. And this is for Maricel Mafani. She's an independent scientist and consultant who specializes in food additive research. Yet, a core component of the FDA's regulation of food contact materials is based on the assumption that these substances may migrate into and be present in food. So again, try seeing if you have containers like this at home, try finding out what's in them. Just try it. Okay, so let's talk about cleaning up abandoned hazardous waste sites. Is there anything that the government does? When a company moves in, they do something very, very toxic, and then they just kind of leave it there, keep dumping stuff in there. Well, in 1980, there was something called the Superfund that was passed, and then Sarah came about in 1986, and that was sort of the upgraded Superfund version. And what this is supposed to do is send EPA representatives out to abandoned hazardous waste sites and evaluate them, and then put them on a national priority list based on just how risky they are. So, site assessment, risk assessment, is it sending contaminated air or particles into the air? Is it leaching into the water? What's going on? So they put them in order according to that. And here's a whole bunch of USA Superfund sites. So there you go. Now, ideally, the EPA and the government would make the polluter pay, and they should pay for the assessment and the cleanup. And if they don't, like they just declared bankruptcy or something, the Superfund, meaning you, they have to pay. A lot of these companies, by the way, get forgiven. Maybe they pay one fine and away they go. And okay, the burden, where do you suppose that comes from? The financial burden. So they're a little bit behind in their cleanup of abandoned hazardous waste sites. Just saying. Okay. Yikes. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. So do we have any regulation for what some, in cars and industry can release into the air? Discharges in the air? Yes, we have something called the Clean Air Act. How about discharges to the water? Yes, that's the Clean Water Act. And see your assignment for that one. I won't go into more detail about that. When it comes to land disposal of hazardous waste, we have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And again, that's going to apply to certain specific wastes that have been evaluated and listed by the Environmental Protection Agency. Usually this includes any waste that can be ignited, is corrosive, reactive, toxic, okay, according to whatever the EPA has for their criteria. And supposedly these chemicals should be cradled to grave. So it should follow these chemicals from the very beginning of their process of being made all the way to, okay, where they're being dumped. So the tracking of hazardous waste all the way through, okay? Now, when it comes to workplace hazards, we have something, we have OSHA, the organization that requires employers to provide workplace free from recognized hazards. Now, a lot of people think that, well, OSHA will protect the patient, the student, the passerby, the visitor. No, no, no. OSHA is only there to provide a safe place for workers. Okay, which is still good, but just know it is limited. It just looks at workplace hazards and control and protection from those hazards for the workers. So OSHA does tend to focus on mechanical hazards as well as chemical inhalation hazards. Sadly, they don't really, they have a lot of regulations about a lot of things. When I was taking my OSHA training, I really, really desired to hear more about medical science and science in general, but no, it was mostly about putting out fires and how to change a tire correctly on a big truck. So, all right. So OSHA sets permissible exposure limits or PELs. And so what they do is they say, okay, they look at time on average and your exposure, what are the limits, your thresholds, that sort of thing. And that's what they do. So whenever you see signs like this around the workplace, you probably have OSHA to thank for that. So the OSHA Act, what that does is it provides a safe work environment, and that's the primary emphasis. Also, they stress that workers should have personal protective equipment when there is exposure and risks of exposure. And so it says that, and also it says that employers must provide workers training and information on chemical hazards. And especially, there's usually something in every workplace where there are some, especially chemical hazards. There's something called the Materials Safety Data Sheets, MSDS. I remember when I worked in research, they always said, listen, if OSHA ever comes through, you need to show them immediately where the MSDS forms are at. So in other words, if you're ever exposed, you ingest, or you're exposed to some chemical or substance, you should be able to look it up in this book. And it will tell you what that substance is, what the risk is, how you need to proceed. And this should be in every workplace. Now, this is old school. Okay. MSDSs can now, I mean, you can get them on tablets, and every place that has chemicals has to have MSDS, some either a database that is easily accessible or a book that is easily accessible, but it must be accessible by every employee. So if you get, again, if something splashes in your eye, you better look it up and see what you need to do. Okay. So just to kind of follow up, when it comes to the substance regulation and manufacturing of chemicals, well, there's also something called the Toxic Substance Control Act. And it says, well, it's precautionary. It says before manufacturing new chemicals, a company must notify the EPA, and the EPA can restrict manufacturing, distribution, and use of the chemicals. But as you read in the book, in practice, EPA really, and as I mentioned before, they don't have a big workforce. And so far, they've really only restricted 5 chemicals or sets of chemicals. So, and the big problem is that, again, if there's an industrial secret, there's corporate confidentiality, and they're not going to probably help EPA figure out what's all in their products. Okay. There's a few other acts that you don't need to know about. I'm just going to briefly mention them. They're not going to be on any test, but there's the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008. And this one said there's a ban on the sale of toys and children's products containing phthalates. What about the other chemicals? I know, you're wondering. Interestingly enough, I ordered something really cool from one of my favorite novelty companies. It was being shipped from China, and I kept asking them, okay, where are my novelty items? And if you want to know, they were Parasite Pal lunch boxes. Just, I know, don't ask. Anyway, they said, well, it's on the ship, and we're not sure if we can get them or not. Apparently, it did not pass the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. So it must have contained some nasty chemicals, maybe phthalates or something else from China. There's also something called the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer. And this is something that is supposed to help the worldwide use of on the chemicals that deplete the ozone layers, the ozone, of course. This became enforced in 1989, and it included 197 nations, including the U.S. We did sign it. And again, it puts limits on the production and consumption of specific chemicals like fluorocarbons and things like that. All right, that is it. So one more week in the hopper. Enjoy the assignment for the week. It's very interesting. It's an eye-opener. So take care.